Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this ETTG event on the recent European elections and their implications for the future of Europe's international partnerships. ECDPM is proud founding member of this network of 6 leading think tanks headed by Iliana and Olivié that works on EU international cooperation and external action towards global sustainable development. We look at European policies, assess how these are put into practice, but complement this with the national perspective of our home countries. It is clear that in these times of fake news and belly button gazing, our collective work is only getting more important and more relevant. As the dust settles, we find ourselves reflecting on the results of the far right in Parliament. The reactions to these results fall into 2 distinct categories. Those who are relieved that the outcome wasn't worse, and those who believe that the future trends are clear and that the worst is yet to come. What we can safely conclude, however, is that the predicted landslide victory of the right-wing parties did not materialize, and the center held its ground better than expected. The political landscape within the member states is also changing. This, coupled with the electoral results of the European Parliament, will impact on the formation of the next Commission and the EU's future direction and priorities in foreign and development policies. And although these elections weren't primarily about defining Europe's role on the global stage, and despite the Parliament's limited influence on international relations, how Europe will conduct itself abroad will have consequences for our domestic achievements as well. The extent of the far right's influence will depend on their ability to organize and exert coherent pressure. We will gain a clearer picture of what's to come when we know if Ursula von der Leyen stays on as Commission Chief, and if so, what her political priorities will be, which coalition will back her, and what will be the distribution of key positions. The results of the upcoming general elections in France will be another key moment to assess the role that France will play in the next political cycle, and I do hope that if there is time, Sébastien will enlighten us on that issue. Overall, though, when it comes to Europe's international cooperation, we anticipate more continuity than some had predicted before the elections. Existing trends, such as a move towards European self-interest, shared interests with partners, and a more transactional approach will likely deepen. There will be further integration of EU internal external priorities with a strong focus on securing economic competitiveness, investing in our security, and on migration management. Looking ahead, the EU's Global Gateway strategy may become the main framework for EU international cooperation, with a strong emphasis on countries' strategic interest and a focus of economic competitiveness inside Europe and economic transformation and connectivity outside. Thematically, the last European Parliament and Commission prioritized green and digital initiatives both internally and externally, and these lasted despite COVID-19 and the Russian war against Ukraine. Green priorities will remain, driven by a strong constituency and geopolitical and economic imperatives, though the political backing isn't as robust as before. The next EU long-term budget will inevitably be shaped by European Parliament and a next European Commission leaning more towards the right, Ukraine, and the magnitude of internal EU agendas. Negotiations will formally start in 2025. These are expected to be contentious, and with several European countries cutting their bilateral aid, there will be an even stronger desire to influence the priorities of the EU's development and international cooperation budgets. Africa remains a strategic priority for Europe, although the continued fallout from war in Ukraine and the Israel-Hamas conflict has limited Europe's high-level focus. The question is what kind of priority Africa will be, which topics will dominate the agenda, and what new policy initiatives will emerge. A European self-centered dialogue is not what African partners desire, but there are important areas for stronger cooperation. For example, there's ample scope to link the EU's focus on economic competitiveness with industrial development agendas in Africa. A dedicated and credible strategy to address rising fragility would help both Europe and Africa in terms of stability, governance, and building mutually beneficial relationships. Migration management is becoming increasingly important for the right and the center-right. A stronger accent on migration management may cause friction with neighboring countries and further undermine the EU's credibility as a promoter of human rights and democratic values. Historically, the European Parliament has been a vocal advocate for promoting democracy, human rights, and civil society international. While this won't completely change, there will be fewer voices and less experienced MEP championing this agenda in the new Parliament. At the same time, political groups in the center and center-left will still influence EU foreign relations, ensuring that European competitiveness and migration management aren't the sole focus of the EU's engagement. These are some of the general reflections I wanted to share with you on the possible and probable way forward for Europe in the world. My esteemed colleagues will go deeper in a number of specific topics and regions. I would like to give the floor to Shada Islam. Shada is an award-winning independent analyst and a commentator on EU affairs, and also runs her own strategy company, New Horizons. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what we need, Shada, New Horizons. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carl, for introducing me as well and for setting the scene, as it were. A lot of uncertainties, as you pointed out, and there's lots of colorful ways of describing how we feel about these elections. And I think the best formula I found is to say it's a very sobering moment. A very sobering moment for all of us. Not a wake-up call, because we've had several wake-up calls before. And the story, as you said, Carl, is still being played out. And of course, we're looking for a new leadership at the European institutions level as well. But one thing that struck with me when I read that was that 1 out of 4 deputies in the European Parliament will be from the hard right. And they will be in the chair of several committees, I think. So I think we need to keep that in mind as we now go forward into our panel discussions. So let me introduce them very, very briefly. Axel Berger, Deputy Director, German Institute of Development and Sustainability. Dora Meredith, Director of ODI Europe. Ambassador Ferdinando Nelli Feroci, President Instituto Affari Internazionali. Iliana Olivié, Director, European Think Tanks Group, the ETTG. Charles Powell, Director, Real Instituto Elcano. Sébastien Treyer, Director, Institut de Développement durable et des relations internationales. And just to say that Ferdinando and Charles have to leave at 6:30, so you can sneak out at that time, right? Okay, guys? Okay, so once our panel discussion is over, we also have the privilege of having with us Karim Aynaoui, Executive President of the Policy Center for the New South, sitting here in the front row. How are you, Karim? And Ambassador Gloria Navarrete, Ambassador of Chile to Belgium. So as we said, we have some specific questions for each of you, given your experience and expertise. And I'm going to start with a more general question to Ferdinando and to Charles. First, Ferdinando, you. The impact of these elections on the EU's role and influence in the world, enhanced or reduced?
Let me see if I can switch it on.
I think it's on.
It's already on, sorry. Well, thank you very much for offering this opportunity, and thank to the audience for being here with us this evening. Now, up to your point, probably this is one of the most complicated questions to answer, because if one looks at the performance of the EU so far, the judgment is very split. I mean, the performance on the external projection of the European Union. On traditional foreign policy issues, you have quite a positive and brilliant stand by the European Union on the conflict in Ukraine, incredibly united. One thinks that the difficulties we had in the past in delivering a common position when it comes to relation with Russia, this time we're capable to stick together to an effective common position. Now, it included, among other things, provision of assistance to the aggressor country with all possible means, including with military means. Problems will probably increase in the near future if the situation on the ground will not improve, as it seems to be the case. But if you look at the other conflict, which is developing at the borders of Europe, the performance has been this one could say, not as brilliant. In fact, it was completely disappointing. Never, unfortunately, this is not the case. as it has been the case in the past, on an issue that had to do with the conflict between Israel and the Palestinian people, the European countries split in all possible occasions. And the end result of this was a total irrelevance of the EU when it comes to that particular conflict, which is also a threat to our security, by the way, as the one in Ukraine. If you look at the future, in my own view, there are no specific reasons to be optimistic because the fundamentals are there and the fundamentals remain, and they are basically of two nature. The first one has to do with the fact that so far we've not been able to develop a common cultural threat. We've not been able to develop a common perception of it among the 27 member states. And since the foreign policy remains a competence basically of the governments of the member countries, I see few chances of an improvement of our performance in the future. I hope to be wrong in a sense. And there is another question, which is also very important, which has to do with the decision-making procedures when it comes to foreign policy. The unanimity rule, with all the possibilities of inserting into that unanimity rule some flexibility, I think it's going to be very complicated. If I may, we have to be very short, right?
Yes,
a few minutes. One last remark, which has to do more generally with the external projection of the European Union, because we tend to assume that it's only based on foreign policy performance. There is much more than that. And one has to think of cooperation, development cooperation, one has to think what the European Union does on trade, one has to think of the climate diplomacy and management of migratory flows. So if you look at the overall picture, maybe the overall judgment is less pessimistic than the one I delivered a moment ago. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Ferdinando. And you do see that trade is, trade agreements are being signed and things like that. So you're right to say that. But collective failure. But Charles, isn't it true that individual countries, including Spain, Belgium, Ireland, Slovenia, have taken steps individually that do mark them out as being more, let's say, present and more conscious of the dangers of what's happening in Gaza?
Yes, indeed, Shada. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. Before answering your very pertinent question, can I just point out three general issues that I think are of relevance here. First of all, the European Parliament is important. No one's denying that, especially since co-decision was introduced. But let's also be quite frank about this. It's not a major foreign policy player. Foreign policy is basically very intergovernmental. If anything, the Commission has grown much more in importance as a result of COVID in particular, but also as a result of trade wars and so on, than the European Parliament itself. So what we really have to worry about, I think, is not just the 25% of right-wing MEPs, but more importantly, I would argue, what's going to happen in the two key member states, France and Germany. The fact that in France and Germany the results are really quite worrying, I think, is the issue that we need to concern ourselves about. Spain is actually quite unique. The two big parties won 63% of the vote between them. Spain remains strongly Europeanist, and Vox, our homegrown variety of this populist right-wing brand, only won 10% of the vote. So we can't be complacent, but that's not such a bad outcome. And thirdly, of course, the impact, the relationship between the electoral result in the European Parliament and the composition of the Commission is not lineal, shall we say, to put it politely, right? So we can, presumably, I'm assuming we'll have a Commission which is run by Ursula von der Leyen, with Costa as president of the European Council and Kallas as HRVP. That's not such a bad outcome. I think it's a mainstream Europeanist outcome. So think tankers prefer change to continuity, but I also see quite a lot of continuity. Going back to your question, though, we've debated this very hotly in Spain. What's the point of recognizing the state of Palestine? It moves the needle, in our opinion. Yes, of course, you can say there is no state of Palestine functioning on the ground. This doesn't actually dramatically change anything. But what I can tell you is that as I travel around the world, as I travel around the Middle East, people on the street say, well done, Spain. And I think that's encouraging. I think it it raises a broader issue, which is how is the next European Commission, how in this next institutional cycle, how are we going to deal with the so-called Global South, which at Elcano we prefer to call the plural South, because it is very plural. And again, here we also have to be frank. We are losing the so-called Global South or plural South. We're losing it partly because of Ukraine, because they don't understand, many of these states don't understand why we regard Ukraine as existential and Gaza as totally secondary. And it's not because they don't share our values, as is so often wrongly said. I'm particularly interested in Latin America, as you can probably imagine, for obvious reasons. Most Latin American peoples and governments do share what we wrongly describe as European values, because they are universal values, after all. What we are seeing, though, is that these Latin American states are becoming more transactional with the EU. They are hedging, and quite rightly, in my view, because we defend the so-called liberal international order, and they very often ask us, well, what the hell has the liberal international order done for us, frankly? So as far as the Global South, so-called Global South is concerned, we basically need to listen more and preach less. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do wish we'd stop saying so-called Global South. I mean, in this city, we keep saying it as well. And I think we just have to be realistic. Yes, it's plural, but so are we. So are we. I mean, we also are a plural entity. But thank you very much for Charles. And a long way from the honest broker that the EU used to be in the Middle East. And, you and I remember that. Thank you very much indeed. So another topic which is going to be impacted by the change in leadership and the parliament, etc. Obviously, climate change and the Green Deal and the green transition. We've already seen rollbacks being done under pressure of certain parties, including the farmers' parties and deforestation as well. So Dora, ODI Europe, if I could ask what your predictions are on that front.
Thanks very much, Shada. Indeed, I think the fight against climate change can go on, but the political landscape will make this much harder. I don't anticipate a big revision in terms of the Green Deal as a whole, but backsliding, as you say, is a possibility in terms of implementation. For example, we've already seen rolling back on the 2035 ban on combustion engine cars already being spoken about. I think the important point for me when I'm sort of trying to think about what's to come is that in 2019 to 2024, under the last Parliament, Renew, the S&D, the Greens and the left grouping could create a majority. And that was used at least twice for the climate law and for the vehicle law, which I've just referred to. And that possibility doesn't exist anymore, which could mean a much more conservative approach to green files. So in terms of implementation of the Green Deal, there will need to be a lot more work to be done, both to try to convince a political leadership which is potentially more conservative, but also in selling that to the electorate. And relationships with industry and member states here will, of course, be key. Turning externally, which is, of course, our areas of expertise, there will remain significant diplomatic pressure from the South for measures to be taken in terms of climate, such as an ambitious 2035 NDC ahead of COP30, partnerships which seize the green energy opportunities and the reform of financial systems to support the transition. The alignments of trade policy, as was referred to, with climate ambitions, such as the CBAM, such as the deforestation regulation, are likely to be received, could be received well domestically, as they do potentially, they can be seen to align with the kind of competitiveness agenda. But there is really a need to make sure that there is the technical and financial support to partner countries provided, and that implementation is done carefully with a way that creates a feeling of co-ownership instead of this being imposed on countries. And because of this, I would say enhanced climate diplomacy and sincere cooperation will be critical in making this work externally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dora. So it's very interesting, isn't it, that even a country as, going to say modest as Indonesia, has gone very public with its anger at European hypocrisy on issues to do with the Green Deal and CBAM and the rest of it. So I think we really are, if we're losing Indonesia on issues like this, I think we're really in trouble. So that's another warning, I think. So Sébastien Treyer, your opinion on the Green Deal, how it's going to live up and can it survive?
So I will actually complement what Dora has been saying because we are agreeing on what I agree a lot with what she said. I think I want to just stress the fact that a lot of the business community, and particularly in France, I could testify that, is not really pushing for going backwards because they have invested a lot of financial capital, but also political capital in making a transformation happen. I mean, I can talk about the automotive industry in France. They have been reluctant. It's the far-right political parties who say we need to get rid of that objective, not anymore the industry. So that's something that I wanted to say. So the decarbonization long-term objective stays in the race. They're asking for a change in the method. And in the method, they're asking for more money because they see that the money is flowing in the US and that there are protectionist measures and they want the same. And that's, to me, something that is very important when we look at the future. So I see how, because of strategic autonomy, energy security, many of the energy and climate side of the Green Deal can stay in line with the next legislature. Not so much on agri-food and biodiversity. As you said, this is something that is going to be very, very complicated to deal with. But there is going to be a big push for industrial policies. There had been this Antwerp declaration on an industrial deal, quite worrying because not very ambitious on climate. And not a lot of French companies are signing up to it because it's not ambitious enough. But so I just want to stress 2 points on these industrial policies because I believe they are going to be quite a defining concept for the next mandate. I'm not going to talk first about the funding because that's what everybody's looking at. How do you fund that? But at what are the instruments? And this is important to me because the worst thing we could do is to have a lot of funding towards the incumbents that would not change anything, but just capture a lot of the money. That's very often what happens with those types of state aid movements. And it could be also something just relaxation of state aid constraints, which means only Germany would fund its economy. France, I mean, in 2022, the state aid notified to the Commission were half German, a quarter French, and only 25% for 25 other member states. And France is not going to be any more in capacity to fund that state aid. So very unequal. So we need to, as think tanks working on external and internal sustainability, we need to really fight for what are the types of instruments behind these industrial policies. The fact that the CDU is the dominant group of the members of the European Parliament, they are not very interested in industrial policies, and that's a good thing. Let's make it a positive thing, because we need also to define policies that are good. The Green parties have done quite interesting results in northern countries, and so they could also ask for frugality in these industrial policies, but being piloted by long-term objectives on being green. And so I think there are things that we can win there. The second thing that I wanted to say is about funding. Of course, France was one of the advocates about getting new financial instruments to get more money for the means of implementation of the Green Deal and this industrial deal. France has no voice. France is always
France is a
there,
strong voice.
but France is weakened a lot by the current situation, and I think any scenario in the political situation will have weakened voice in Brussels. So I see a lot of problems behind nobody pushing for more money, and that would be the consequences of what I've been saying. Is first, there might be a lack of funding for making the green industry, the industrial deal being green, and that's a worry for the situation for climate. But that there might be also a lot of money pushed for defense industry at the expense of also development aid. So these things are to me very important. And the last thing that I want to say as a quick consequence for external policies of what I've been saying is that we really need to build a strong economic and political case for what Dora was advocating for. If we are going to build industrial policies that are just self-centered to get more industrial jobs in Europe, first, that's not going to happen. And second, it's going to be a very bad message for our southern country partners. And we are at IDDRI with the ETTG members, I think, really working on the fact that there is a case that if there is an industrial policy, it should be also with the strong industrial partnerships with southern countries. And that's something that, and may they be green. That's because I'm working in the Sustainability Institute, and I believe that's the way forward. That's the fact that we need to not just source raw materials from these countries, but establish strong industrial partnerships. That's something very important.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Very, very good point to make. So coming to you, Iliana. So Sébastien's already talked about how much money we're going to be spending on defense. And of course, there's also the 2030 agenda, sustainable development. There's going to be a summit in September in the UN, the Summit of the Future. And as far as I can tell, not much progress is being made. In fact, these wars don't help either in terms of destruction and devastation. So what is your forecast for implementation of the SDGs and Agenda 2030?
Yes, I don't think that the elections will have a major impact on the SDGs agenda, and this is not necessarily good news because the agenda was already losing a lot of political traction, and for a series of reasons. You already mentioned one: international events like the COVID pandemic, the crisis, the war in Ukraine. Also because of the rising domestic and regional agendas, like the ones executed by Sébastien and Dora. So this strategic autonomy clashes somehow with the SDGs agenda on some points, and also because there was already a process of contagion, let's say, of the vision of populist parties of the agenda to the mainstream vision of the agenda. So in several countries, well, Spain, I think, is a very good example of that. You can see the center-right party distancing itself from the agenda, although it is the country that voted for the agenda in 2015. So this, let's say that the impact of the rise of far-right populist party was already happening before the elections. So in that sense, no major impact. In line with what Charles already said, this is not the European Parliament that is going to deal with the agenda, but of course, the political position of Germany and France are key for the future of the agenda, and in that sense, the prospects are not that good. But there is this other part, which is, as you mentioned, financing the agenda, and this is the agenda international finance for development. We will have the new summit 10 years after the Addis Ababa summit in Spain next year, and that agenda, although it is linked, it is in the framework of the 2030 agenda and it is linked to the SDGs, has not that much intoxicated by contentious political vision. So maybe in that sense, and also in line with this more interest-driven view of international partnerships, maybe there is some room for improvement in that particular area.
Yeah, we're going to come in a second round to this new sort of paradigm that the EU Commission at least seems to be developing on international partnerships versus development cooperation. But thank you very much for indicating already some of these sort of challenges we face. Axel, please, your point of view on this.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to not to start with the election results, but to take a look at what is happening outside of the EU. And I mean, you've just referred to the Summit of the Future. We had an SDG summit last year, which took stock. Anyway, and my reading of these summits, the SDG summit was quite encouraging. I mean, first of all, they were able to agree on a couple of important messages, important framings, so that they said, okay, the agenda is still important. It's important to accelerate the implementation of the agenda. Obviously, we had a couple of setbacks, in particular through the COVID-19 pandemic. And reading now the summary document of the Summit of the Future, it doesn't look bad, right? So the message I'd like to make is we still have an international agenda, international framing, an international target system, which is kind of shared by basically most of the countries, right? And that's why I would argue the member states of the European Union, the EU, as an institution, needs to play a key role in order to accelerate the implementation of the Agenda 2030 until 2030. Obviously, looking at the election results, it will not be easy, right? Many of the countries are more and more inward-looking, including my country. We have a strong focus on the green dimension of the sustainability agenda. I would argue it's only a third of the agenda, right? I mean, the problems or the pushback with regard to, I don't know, CBAM or the deforestation law that we saw in many countries tells us, okay, let's not only focus on the green aspects, but also on the other dimension of the sustainability agenda. So the EU needs to focus more on sustainability, and I think there's also a chance here. And last point, although the agenda is still valid until 2030, we need to think already now beyond 2030. What kind of framework should come next? What kind of target system? I'm raising this question because this commission will play a key role in negotiating the next agenda. The next SDG summit in 2027 will play a key role, and that's should be the core business of the next commission.
Right. That brings me to the question of what will be the core interests and policy guidelines of the next commission. So I know that Charles, you and Ferdinando have to leave early, so I'm going to ask you the question now. So what should we be expecting from this next commission? I mean, the last one was geopolitical, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But, you know, we've got this sort of specter of another Donald Trump presidency sort of there. And then obviously the wars that we referred to, you obviously just come back from the Middle East or have traveled across. So what can we expect and what would you like? I mean, not just what we can expect.
Well, I'd like a lot of things, but I'm not expecting a whole lot.
Okay.
I think this is going to be an inward-looking commission. Let me also remind all of us, this is rather depressing. You know, if you think about the fate of the outgoing commission, it was largely determined by two external shocks over which we have no control: COVID and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So, you know, let's keep our hats on. There may well be further external shocks over which we in the European Union have very little control. But having said that, assuming we do have a modicum of control, I think this is going to be a more inward-looking commission. Why? Because of growing concern about our really rather underwhelming economic performance. The idea that we really have to get our economic house in order in a way in which we haven't really been doing in a long, long time. Why? Because of sluggish growth, because of low competitiveness, because of the fact that we're clearly falling behind China and the US in technological terms. So I think we'll see a lot of political capital and energy being spent on debates concerning completing, safeguarding, and leveraging the internal market. And of course, here we have Enrico Letta's rather useful reform. I'm sure you've all read Enrico Letta's reform, but I think it's a very valid one in the sense that he simply points out that the internal market, which is ultimately what we still are, above all, that is what we are, whether we like it or not. We may fancy ourselves as a global actor, but we are basically an internal market, is incomplete because it doesn't contemplate energy, financial services, or digital communications. So we'll spend a lot of time on those debates. It's already been mentioned, industrial policy, an industrial policy fit for purpose, fit for the 21st century. More debates about open strategic autonomy with the emphasis on open, and of course the latest debate on economic security. So all of that, I think, will be rather inward-looking. Add to that, of course, the emphasis on defense and security. So a securitization of the Commission's internal agenda, which will, of course, be very closely related to industrial policy. That is what I think the incoming Commission would like to be able to concentrate on. Whether or not we are able to do this will depend, I think, on three things. First of all, what happens in November in the United States. If Donald Trump is elected in November, as I'm afraid now seems increasingly likely, we will have a president in the White House again who is not only extremely hostile to the European Union, but also someone who will disregard our views on how to do every major global issue and will continue to undermine multilateral institutions, not least, by the way, the WTO. The second issue, of course, is our relationship with China. And again, the result of the election in November in the US will have an impact, a massive impact on the next commission, because the US basically sees its relationship with the EU through the prism of its systemic ongoing rivalry with China. In other words, with Trump in the Oval Office, we will have massive tariff barriers, trade wars, a disruption of global trade. And, you know, again, when push comes to shove, we are in the EU very poorly equipped to survive and prosper in a world dominated by great power rivalry. And finally, the third issue, external issue, which this commission will have to try to rethink, I think, is its relationship with the emerging economies, as we were saying earlier. Global Gateway, by the way, needs to be revamped and rethought, frankly, and it can't just be a bad copy of China's One Belt, One Road, which is frankly what it's increasingly looking like to me. And of course, it's not just about Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and other Korea, Japan, other like-minded economies. It's about the countries that I was mentioning earlier. And I know this is a Spanish obsession, but let me make my pitch anyway. It's outrageous that we can't get the Mercosur deal. And it's not just because of us, and self-interest is a great thing, no problem with self-interest. If the EU signed the trade deal with Mercosur, tariff barriers, internal, intra-Latin American tariff barriers would largely disappear. There would be an enormous increase in intra-Latin American trade, which would be fantastic for Latin American prosperity, not just the EU-Latin America relationship. But I'm not holding my breath. Thank you.
Right. It's interesting because I think that's probably why at some point, though he's given up now, Macron was talking about Draghi, because the competitive agenda as the next president of the European Commission, I think that now is of course not going to happen, but that would have been that inward looking, but focused on the economy and the competitiveness. That was his idea, I think, anyway. Thank you very much indeed for that. Ferdinando, your views on this?
Well, first of all, let me say that it's very difficult to disagree with Charles' assessment of the situation. Basically, I agree 100% with what he said, including his first remark about his skepticism about the strategies or strategy-driven agendas. Lesson of the past legislature was that they were an agenda which was events-driven. So with all the skepticism about programs and strategies, I think that the way I see it, I see three main subjects as priority issues in the agenda for the EU, for the Commission, and for the EU in general and the next legislature. The first one is competitiveness. And again, there is little that I can add to what Charles said, except that, of course, we have the later report, 146 pages, full of very operational recommendations, policy recommendations. Some of them easily agreeable, others are very controversial, as it was shown by the first reaction in the European Council when Enrico Letta presented the draft the report. We will also have in a few weeks' time another report by Mario Draghi on competitiveness. He has provided some anticipation on what are his ideas. I would hope that the Commission, the next one, Commission will take over from those reports to define a strategy that would include both a relaunch of the internal market and also a more concrete strategy for competitiveness, which would include a new approach to industrial policy, which was also an almost forbidden word not too long ago. Now it's becoming a central issue in the agenda, including measures to reduce dependencies from abroad, which means in particular to reduce dependencies from China, to be very honest. I would bring us to the other subject, very complicated to deal with in the next legislature. And also, if possible, programs that be able to make available EU common resources to improve and increase competitiveness of the European economies. Because if we leave it only to national financial resources, the impact would be a fragmentation of the internal market, as we have seen with the use of state aid when the Commission made it possible to use it in a quite liberal manner. Second subject that I would see central is defense, but with some note of caution, not that I am imagining the European Union becoming a military alliance. This is not in the cards. It's not the vocation of the Union. But at least that the EU could help improving and increasing national capabilities in the military field to be utilized as accompanying measures to reinforce, to complete, to make more effective our common foreign policy. And also as part of an effort to strengthen the so-called European pillar of the alliance, of the NATO alliance, particularly if the prospect in Washington is the return of Donald Trump to the White House. Then we would definitely need to be more self-reliant defense than we used to be so far. The third subject, which has not been raised so far in this room, is enlargement. We have made very solemn promises to a number of countries, not only countries that are in the waiting room since 21 years, I'm referring to the countries of the Western Balkans, where frustration is increasingly growing at worrying levels, but also to countries like Ukraine, which is a very problematic country, to say the least. And there we have to be consistent with our promises, but at the same time, I think we have to equip ourselves within the Union to be able to digest, if I may use this expression, new members without hampering the functioning of the European Union. And this is an enormous challenge on which I think that the Commission will have to make proposal rather soon. The moment of truth will be the presentation of the next proposal by the Commission for the MFF, for the next financial program of the EU budget. There we will see where exactly are the ambitions. And so I would see an agenda articulated at least around these three main issues. Competitiveness, of course, is a huge subject, defense, in the way I described it, and enlargement with all the challenges that this implies. Thank you.
Okay, Ferdinando, without putting you on the spot on this one, but Giorgia Meloni, your prime minister, wants more of a role, right? Not just in the EU Council of Ministers, Council, but also within the Commission, obviously. So, she will be sending a commissioner who obviously, reflects her views, right? Right?
It's a good point. I was waiting for that question. In fact, I think there is a lot of curiosity for Giorgia Meloni's role in the next legislature. Difficult to answer directly. So far, she has adopted a rather pragmatic attitude when it comes to relations between her governments and Italy in general and the European Union. She has given up all the more radical statements that she made when she was in opposition. She has become apparently more reasonable, but certainly she's not a leader who has a vision for the future of Europe. She maintains a rather transactional approach to Europe. So I will use Europe until Europe serves my purposes. And this is something which all will have to take into account. But if there is a mistake that should be avoided, is to push her to the far right extreme. So I'm referring to what happened not too long ago here in Brussels. I mean, I think she needs to be encouraged to be involved. She does not need to be pushed at the extreme rightist component of the spectrum of the parties that are represented in the European Parliament. The temptation is there. The temptation is there. So I think that all what can be done together and vote, not to exclude her, not to push her far apart towards the right, and I think would be useful and would serve the purpose of a reasonable and constructive European agenda.
She's using that as a bargaining chip, obviously. That's the very fact what you've said. Right, thank you, gentlemen. I know that you may have to.
No, we can stay.
Please stay as long as you can. I'm not throwing you out.
Yeah.
No. Okay, so let's go back to Iliana. Let me start with you on this. So we're sort of on the line. God knows why I decided this was going to be a geopolitical commission. Now we've seen that already. International partnerships. You've got the global gateway. A lot of my friends who are development experts, etc., worried that the fragility issue, the issue of the most vulnerable, leaving no one behind, all of those issues that was kind of the hallmark, right, of the EU has been submerged into this big project, which global gateway, which I think Charles has well described as something little amorphous, I think. So what do you expect happening in the next, and the new briefing book that we read, all of us, leaked by Politico, showing that's very, very economic oriented, economic interest, access to raw materials and all the rest of it. So that's a paradigm shift happening, right?
Yes, but it's probably more the narrative than the actual tools. And Charles has said many times, when it's geopolitical, it's a very clumsy geopolitical actor. I think it's the word that you often use. So yes, it was a reaction to China, and then a few weeks later, it was not a reaction to China's BRI anymore, and then it was again a reaction to China. So the communication and the narrative has been extremely confusing. And also the fact that we have, as we all know here, different tools overlapping for very similar objectives. So NDICI, Team Europe initiatives, Global Gateway. I think it's a good thing that the Commission tried to react with something. So it was seen as a too institutional actor and with very little capacity to be flexible and to react to crisis. So it tried to react to.
It was 13 years after the BRI that the Global Gateway was announced.
Yes, but it was somehow a reaction to the different crises, to the pandemic, and then to the war. So it was somehow a way to try. They were trying to react to something, not exclusively to China. So probably they have a point when they say that it's not just the answer to China. So, but here probably the problem is with the narrative and the expectations, because of course all this happens in the framework of the multi-annual financial framework and the existing tools. So probably Global Gateway is not even going, I'm not saying that those should be the objectives of the international partnership, but even they were, and we all agree that they are, probably it is not going to deliver at that level. So, and at some point we will be faced with a new multi-annual financial framework, and how are we going to combine, and how is the Commission going to combine all the existing tools? Of course, there is this issue of the more traditional tools being left aside. This is something that all the ETTG members have written about, and it's very obvious that in the end, it is understandable to try to have a shift from the very social agenda of the previous years to something more grounded in the economic side of development, and maybe based on the interest of the donors, maybe, and again, if we agree, but in the end, we have a toolbox, and there is a number of instruments that have been feeding political dialogue with partner countries for decades, and probably they will still be there. And those are part of the institutional relations of the Commission.
Thank you very much, Iliana. So, Sébastien, France has always led on, well, used to when I was a young reporter running around Africa and Asia covering development cooperation. It used to be, a development commissioner came from France or Italy, and then, it was very high up on your agenda. And now when you look at how this whole operation is turned into something much more economic, we don't talk about values, we talk about economic interest. Where do you see this change leading us?
So I don't know how to really answer on what you say about France, because it's complicated to know what's going to be whatever the results of the parliament elections.
Absolutely.
I believe the president still has a word on the external policy, and it's going to be complicated to understand what that means for development aid. Of course, the Ministry of Finance would be, if it's from another political party, is going to be complicated. I think I wanted to really say that what I hear, particularly from France, for instance, is a lot of emphasis on the issue of investment for sustainable development, meaning probably productive investment, including infrastructure and civil and public service, but really the issue of productive investments. And I think behind that, they are developing a narrative using, we heard that also from the Belgian presidency, using examples where you build real industrial partnerships. I'm coming back to the word that I used before, using the example of vaccines or pharmaceuticals, where you don't just try to transfer technologies, but you're really trying to foster the development of industrial capacities in developing countries, both on the health side, so not just completely aside from the central point of aid that would be centered on health and education, but really looking at the health industry as something that also needs to be developed. And I think that's going to be quite interesting. I like that example because I think this is quite in line with what we hear, I mean, what I can be hearing from the African colleagues, but also Latin American colleagues about what they want. Something that would be transactional, that does not mean being only centered on self-interest and on short term, but something that could be clearer. But for the moment, what the southern countries are hearing are we want our security of supply, hydrogen and critical raw materials. We are going to have CBAM, and we have the example of the Mattei plan by Madame Meloni for Africa. That is something about investments, but very self-centered. Sorry, I don't know Mattei plan in detail, so I'm turning to Ferdinando. You might, okay, nobody knows. But that's how it's perceived, at least. So interesting.
The agreement or whatever it's called, yes.
But it's very,
Africa plan.
very pragmatic, but very self-centered on developing access to resources or markets for Italian companies. That's how it's perceived. I can't talk about what's really in it. And so we really need to change the narrative. And in that context, using examples like the health example is very, very important. I have two last points that I want to say. In the international context, there have also been these elections in South Africa and in India, where it was a relief to us talking to think tanks in those two countries saying, actually, our democracy is not that degraded. We are going to have coalitions that are going to be probably quite constructive for the international order. And you were mentioning Indonesia. These countries, Indonesia, India, South Africa, Brazil, they are going to play a key role in the way that probably they will take some kind of not a leadership that neither the US nor the EU are going to have in the next period. And so it's really important that we are able to have a collaborative vision with them. On my side, I see also South Africa before the election being really targeting the EU because of CBAM, but not offering really an alternative solution to it. So really using that as a diplomatic and rhetoric tool, but not really as something that makes sense. In the way that they didn't have anything to say that what would be the alternative solution. And I hope that these countries, particularly South Africa, would be having a counter-proposal more on the lines of what the Kenyan president is offering. Saying, my problem is such, that's the solution that I propose. And in those, my last point is to say in those industrial partnerships that I'm talking about since the beginning, because I might be a little bit obsessive about that. There is something about the dependency on Chinese technology that I think we need to discuss with those countries and accept that we are going to have both in Europe and in those countries a dependency on Chinese technologies, which does not mean that it's necessarily just a problem. We can work with that and we need to discuss that, how we work on it.
Right, so I think the EU has to get used to the fact that there are many players in Africa, including African players. So, so lessons learned, I hope. Huh? It's too sad to see the EU behaving as though it has a right of access, and France especially, etc. So hopefully lessons learned, because without that, I don't think we will really salvage our reputation in the global South, Johns. Dora, if I could have your views.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'd echo what has been said. I think I do agree with the priorities that have been noted for the next Commission, but I do also think that in terms of how they're achieved, they cannot possibly be achieved by just being inward looking. Mm-hmm. If we look at international trade, if we look at technologies, all of these things need substantial global engagement. And so because of that, I think the next Commission will have to continue to have a focus on what is happening globally. I think that means in terms of partnership policy, of course, that will need a clear strategy, more work in terms of private sector mobilization, working with other donors, etc. But also thinking about the way that EU external action is currently quite fragmented. So, for example, we have the Team Europe approach at the moment, but that needs to be built upon. But also across the EU, the different policy domains, whether it's migration, crisis, climate, connect. So often these are working in policy silos, and we see with CBAM how that can then have an impact on other areas of policy. So we really need to find a way to better coordinate and to make sure that impact assessments on the extraterritorial impacts of policies are being really taken into account. Finally, I do think there needs to be a concerted push towards reform in multilateral spaces. This links to the point about the US. I don't think that faced with that context, the EU can then say, oh, well, we're going to just look inside and let the world, let what happen. We've got to think, well, what does one do in that situation? For example, MDBs could be central to achieving the climate and development goals at a low cost to EU public finance, but it's currently being delivered far below potential. And the need for reforms there are well understood, but there is a lack of urgency and follow through amongst European shareholders, which needs to be really thought through. So, yeah, I think there has to still be a strong interest in what is happening globally, because frankly, with the challenges facing us, we have no choice.
Right. And I think an important point you raised is also Team Europe. I mean, Team Europe is outside the institutional framework, right? So that's, I think, problematic for quite a few of us. But Team Europe also within the Commission and within the EU institution, because a lot of the departments aren't really working together. So I think that's a good point to make as well, Dora. So yes, Axel, your point of view. And I'm going to be taking questions and short comments from you, but before that, I will of course give the floor also to our guests on the Policy Center for the New South and Ambassador of Chile, but Axel.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, two points. I think Dora already emphasized multilateralism. I think that's also a point I'd like to make, in particular with regard to the WTO. I mean, if the EU has somewhere a competency, right, it's in trade. And obviously the ministerial conferences and what is happening in Geneva is frustrating. I'm following these discussions quite closely, for sure. But if we lose the EU and the EU's member states as champions for multilateralism and WTO reform, the future is not so bright. And I think there are many actors in the WTO with whom the EU could work more, right? I mean, we have the ambassador from Chile here. I mean, Chile is playing in other countries. Really
Apologies, sorry. Sorry for
really playing very proactive roles in the WTO. So there's potential for new alliances. That was the first point. The second point, what we should not forget, and I think we haven't really touched upon it tonight, is we are living in an era of autocratization. Right? We have a huge wave of more and more countries, not necessarily societies, but countries and governments which are turning more autocratic, also in the EU, but also globally. So colleagues at the Institute therefore stressed very much what we do in trade policy, but in particular in development cooperation. We should do it in a way that it doesn't harm democracy, right? How we design our green hydrogen policies, right? With which elites are we working? Or are we also designing our policies that it also involves other states? So do no harm to democracy. I think that's also a key
Axel, all our migration pacts that we're signing are with the worst autocrats in our neighborhood. Yeah.
I'm not saying that you're doing everything right. I think it's I just wanted to stress this.
It's important that we change that.
Has a key role here.
Yeah, thank you. Anything else you want to add?
No, thanks.
Okay.
I'm looking forward to the questions.
All right, thank you very much. So we have 2 seats available here, please. So I would like the Ambassador of Chile to welcome Ambassador Gloria Navarrete, por favor, and also Karim Aynaoui, Executive President, Policy Center for the New South. Mr. Aynaoui, would you like to kick off with some reactions to what you've heard, some comments that you have about what you've heard about the future direction of the EDDRI and how it will impact on the South, the global South?
I got anxious.
Thank
you for the invitation. I think there are many moving pieces. Trust is an issue. Confidence in oneself is another one. And there's no way, I think, that politics, policies, the functioning of Europe, the elected politicians won't be influenced by the mood in the electorate. There is no way that there will be unity. And these dynamics are to be listened to. So they shouldn't be discarded, particularly for a supranational institution such as the complex apparatus of existing here in Brussels. So it has an internal impact. It has to trigger a rethinking process of internal processes, but also the projection of Europe and the European Union abroad. As you know, we're human beings. We're moved by narratives, by romance, by ideas. We're not moved by technicalities and technocracies. We don't dream. This is not the way we function. What is the narrative of the European Union with respect to Africa? What is it that we want to do together? What is it we want to do today in the Mediterranean region? Concretely, energy, migration. We need to have a serious discussion on migration. When I'm saying serious, it has to be tackled up front. We can't go around it and sort of be ashamed of it. We need to have a serious discussion, and you have partners to discuss that with. It can't be only the management of the flows of the month, of the year. We need to have a serious discussion, and there are solutions. But this is a shared challenge. I would say beware of discarding the South in various ways, divided, not homogeneous. You responded to that. I think it represents a reality of a changing world where you have countries that have more agencies, where there is a demand for consideration, where you have to consider their opinions. It makes policies more difficult, particularly in foreign affairs ministries that are historical departments in political systems where there is a sedimented reptilian brain with deep psychological Pavlovian reflexes. So it's a legacy, it's about reform. So there is, yes, you have to, you have to listen to Morocco, you have to listen to Turkey. It's difficult. Before we didn't listen to them. We were just doing things and everybody would align. Well, I'm sorry, but you have kids there running around and you're calling them to come back and sit and they don't want to. That's a little bit the image. But again, let us talk, let us listen. You have allies and like-minded people. And what I'm worried is that my generation will engage with you because we have connected brains, just to summarize very quickly. But I'm not sure that the next generation will do. And don't miss this opportunity. As I'm a dean at a university as well, what we teach to students is really curiosity, reflexivity. So I would say, and we understand, I'll conclude on that it was very challenging for Europe and the rest of us, but more for Europe since 2008, multiple shocks, internal fronts and fragmented politics, etc. And this is understood. So there is also a posture where you have, particularly in Africa, I would say, and the Mediterranean Atlantic of Africa, partners to do things with. But it means we need method, we need to organize it. It's not going to happen by itself. It's a sort of reaggiornamento that is at stake here, maybe internally, but all of us in our societies, because of many issues, climate, generation, demographics, etc., but also among ourselves. So I think think tanks have a critical role to play for that. We're the clinics, basically, doctors of public policies.
Right. Thank you, Karim. And it's so true because I've done a lot of work on EU-Africa relations myself over the years, and the next generation issue that you've raised is so crucial because opinion surveys, opinion polls show that the young generation is not at all enchanted, let's say, or focusing on Europe in a privileged way, let's put it this way. So thank you for raising that issue. Ambassador Gloria, if I can ask you to respond as well.
Thanks so much. I'm quite pleased that I'm the last one to speak because all the most important things are already said. I'm only going to talk from the point of view of Chile, a bit of Latin America, but mainly Chile, regarding, I very much agree with what Mr. Powell said in relation to the unity of the Spain, of Europe, to be broader with Latin America. They tend to think that Latin America always follows the United States, but it's not like that. I always say thank goodness we're not Mexico in Chile. And for us, it's very difficult. And from any point of view, even from the point of view of economy, we are too far to have value chains with the United States. But for Mexico, it's a reality, and it's a very good reality. And there you see the difference already, how much developed is the northern side of Mexico than the southern part of Mexico. Regarding Chile, Chile doesn't receive any cooperation. We are supposed to be like Costa Rica and Uruguay, who are supposed to be graduated, and we understand that, but we also always say that you cannot measure the richness of the need of a country by the per capita income. We need support. And from that point of view, Chile and the European Union have very clear ideas with I had a list of programs that the European Union develops with Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm not going through it, but for us it's important, green transition, renewable, fighting climate change, digital transition, inclusiveness, justice, human rights, democracy. And this is what we are working on, but we work like equal partners. I think listen to what the party wants. I think it was Sébastien who said it should be, what do we want as a recipient country, not consider recipient country more like a partner, because you cannot impose the reception of something. And maybe you are also true in what you said, that the European Union is working very much in a way to try to solve the problem they have with the lack of raw materials. In the case of Chile, we are working very much on green hydrogen, and this is what we have developed a lot, because we aim to be quite a world exporter of green hydrogen, and we also have lithium and copper that are very needed for the batteries. But we don't want to have just what has been the problem before, like an extraction and raw material, and forget what we do, and this is what we achieve in the modernization of the association agreement that it was signed in December last year and approved by the Parliament on the 29th of February this year, is that to develop the possibility to develop value chains and value-added products. For us, that's important. The global gateway is complicated. I hear a lot about global gateway. It's very difficult to understand, because when I see it, and this is my view, and somebody from INTPA will get very upset with me if I said it, it's like you are given a seal to say you are a safe partner, and you can, and we are going to match you with somebody from an investor from Europe, and you have the seal, you are serious, and you are going to develop this area of work. It cannot be like that.
So instructive.
But we have fought for that, so it's not so instructive. We want this, and especially because at home we have very clear, when we are going to develop a big project, you have to go to you have to go and publish it and gain it. So it's not that you are going to assign it to any party or states with just like that. I don't know. This is what I can say from the beginning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm sure there will be some questions, and of course, please feel free to answer as well. Let me move to the floor to short and sweet, not sweet necessarily, but short and short questions as well. Please identify yourself very quickly. And we have a, I'm not going to jump up, but yes, please can I have a show of hands about people who would be, oh, thank you, thank. All right, so let's start with the lady, and then.
Hello everybody, I'm Blondine Bouillon. For the International NGO for Humanity and Inclusion. I thank you very much for this very informative panel discussion. So now I wanted to hear the panelists on human rights. We were talking about the importance of narrative. I very much appreciate what you just said. And well, it seems that this has totally deserted the narrative of the EU, just referring to the briefing book that was leaked. So I wanted to maybe ask you, what do you think could be left of human rights and the role of the EU in this area in the future? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take a few questions and then turn to the panel. Thank you for that.
Hello, so my name is Marguerite and I'm also working in an international NGO called World Vision, and also connected to that, to the question of Blondine previously, I wanted to hear a bit more your views regarding the fragile context. I think you mentioned it, but we didn't dig into it because we talked a lot about value chains and industrial policies that work quite well in many developing contexts and stable contexts. But I think we are seeing the multiplication of crises all over the world and how much they are also impacting neighboring countries. And somehow, I mean, we see a movement in more and more crises, and obviously humanitarian budget not being able to absorb all the needs. And now with in part shifting towards the global gateway, cutting quite a lot of budget also in fragile contexts left, and how much are we going to contribute to stability worldwide? I mean, a bit of your perspective on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions. Yes, please.
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much for hosting this event. My name is Andrew. I work with the Jamaican Embassy and permanent mission to the European Union. My question is in relation to sustainability legislation. Considering the 25% increase in MEPs, I'm not too familiar with how the legislations are enforced. But would they have any impact? Would the presidents have any impact on their enforcement vis-a-vis third states like Latin America and the Caribbean?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shada. In the previous slide, I worked for ECDPM and for ETTG. I have a question that puzzles me a lot because we talk sometimes about the implications of the elections and the new situation in the world for development cooperation, global gateway, but the issues are probably more fundamental. We are in a situation, in a context where you have a lot of non-like-minded countries, which reject this global world order, which reject also universal human rights and other values. We sometimes underestimate this. LGBTQ rights in Brussels, we had recently elections and there was a party that was elected with a program that was also trying to be more accepting the type of unstunt ritual slaughtering, and they got quite popular here in Brussels. We see issues related to female genital mutilation in Gambia these days, big discussion to reverse the legislation on this. So how or what would you advise the new European leadership to deal with these non-like-minded countries? A very important question.
Thank you very much, Gert. Anyone else want to come in? Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Axel. I'm policy officer at the European Development Finance Institutions, EDFI. I have a very short question to the panel here. So will you anticipate or expect any changes to the strategic steering of Global Gateway 2.0, if you can call it that way, under the new commission? Thank you.
Right. right, thank you very much. I don't see any, oh, you do see one more? Please, yeah, go ahead.
So good evening. Thank you so much for the panel. My name is Daniel, and I'm the policy team at Search for Common Grounds process. So I think Mr. Treyer mentioned the increase of the funding for the military and defense sector, which would come at the expense of development aid, and just in general, development aid and has been mentioned quite a bit tonight. I would like to bring into the discussion the triple nexus. So development, humanitarian aid, and peace, and more specifically the third aspect of the nexus. And I would like to know what are your thoughts on the future of the EU as a more, going back to being more of a normative power and being less centered on hard security in terms of its partnerships and how it looks at its impact globally. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. So I'm going to go back to the panel, and obviously you don't have to answer all of the questions, but I think we're seeing a thread there. I mean, obviously concerns about human rights and fragility, sustainability, non-like-minded countries, and global gateway. And then this forgotten item in our vocabulary, normative power. Right? Nobody, thank you for bringing that up. We tend to forget that that's what we used to say we were. So I think, Iliana, maybe starting with you and then going to Karim.
Thank you. Yes, maybe on humanitarian aid crowding out development and on global gateway crowding out human rights, to put it shortly. I think Dora's idea on weight is absolutely inevitable, that the next commission also focuses on the international agenda. I mean, I think that frames the answer. It is unavoidable for the European Union to have a position on human rights and on the triple nexus, for instance, even if they are trying to avoid it at the moment, because everything that the Commission and the major European Union member states are trying to do at home need partners like Chile, like Morocco, not only because of the consistency and the sustainability of the value chains, but also because of that defense of the multilateralism that they will need to keep on doing. And even more so after the results of the US elections, if Donald Trump is elected. So yeah, that would be my very short answer.
But there's a point I want to raise also that Charles raised, and that was to do with human rights and what's happening, let's say the selective outrage, the difference between how the EU is reacting to Russia's aggression on Ukraine, very rightly, right? And then also not applying the same sort of criteria and standards when it comes to Israel and its reaction to the terrible attack by Hamas. So there is this issue when you raise the question of human rights. It's the EU, where is it actually standing by its commitment to international law and human rights?
Absolutely, but also Karim already raised this point. There is a problem of trust, and this problem of trust is also linked to a problem of double standards. So at some point again, the EU is increasingly needing its partners. So in that sense, it will need to deal with this. Of course, this requires probably not coming to a consensus, which is not possible at the moment at the core of the European Union, but at least having an honest conversation of what it means to have European values or European interests, which is there is so not consensus on that front, and to build a new narrative on human rights and a wide variety of policies on the basis of an honest conversation of what are the limits of a common position.
Thank you very much. Axel, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I take the liberty to address Gert's question about the non-like-mindedness of our international system. I'm not sure, to be honest, whether the countries around Europe and worldwide are getting more non-like-minded. I would say that the world is becoming more complex. We are with many countries, we are moving from a relationship between a donor and a recipient more to a partnership based, or at least a more equal power relation. And then obviously these instances of non-like-mindedness are becoming more obvious, right? I think that's for sure. These many countries have more choices now in terms of the partners with which they would like to work. I think that the word transactional has been mentioned several times tonight. So I think that's the situation, and then I think that's the situation the EU also has to respond to see on which areas are we going to organize which alliances, and these alliances aren't overlapping anymore. They are more complex beyond the G7, right? G7 is only 7 countries plus the EU, so the world is more complex, and I think that's the situation we need to address.
Thank you very much, Axel. Sébastien.
Yeah, I wanted to react on 2 points. First, on human rights, one of my key concerns is also the risks for human rights within Europe. I mean, in my own country. So this is something that I think needs to be really fought for by civil society organizations and think tanks to really say that you can't just think about technical economic issues without looking at the human rights issue and the state of, l'état de droit, not finding the word in English, the rule of law. That's something that is extremely important to me. And we are a think tank at IDDRI that is working on sustainability policies. But because if you want to have a sustainable future, you need to give voices to the more vulnerable because of the way that their environment is being damaged. Our technical expertise is also on these legal issues about the rule of law. So there is something where I'm trying to reach out to others and say, this is a space where we need to also fight the battle inside Europe. And I think I have no real solution to what the puzzle by Gert on this issue of if Europe insists on human rights, how to deal with those who really are not aligned with those. I would really say we need to be much more listening to those who are really like-minded already. I know, Gert, you were saying, let's not focus only on those, but I hear from Ambassador from Chile and Karim, there are things that we share in our visions of what matters. And this was also the message from our colleagues in South Africa. Consider us allies on the way that we look at democracy, building coalitions, policy coalitions, etc. So probably when we are not aligned on every thing, at least let's see that there are lots of things that we can, if we listen well to one another, there are lots of things that we can fight for in common. The second thing that I wanted to say is that we are really looking at, I mean, a lot of what we build with colleagues in African countries is about, let's build an industrial investment plan for African countries. That's how we can attract back investors in the country. And a lot of our colleagues are saying we need to do that, and at the same time understand that our countries are under a permanent crisis also, that we build plans that will never be completely implemented. We need the plans, but we need also to fight for something that is consolidating or making our institutions more robust and solid. And so I have I see the point that you're making, and I think we should not just say that fragile states don't need the plans, but we need to ensure that we have both types of interventions.
There's also the sticky question of debt relief, which is we haven't really talked about. And then, your points, I mean, are very well taken on human rights, but we have to walk our talk, even at home. And that's point, Sébastien, thank you for raising it. I mean, our own situation when we talk about our migration policy, our detention camps, etc. Not to mention the restrictions that we are putting on many of our demonstrations, etc. So we really have to be practice what we preach. So thank you very much for that. Dora, please.
Yes, I quite agree. And I think for me, there's also an opportunity in terms of creating more sophisticated types of partnership to address some of the human rights, but also potentially the fragility or the different types of countries that the EU partners with need different types of partnership, and those partnerships can have built into them, sort of steers in terms of values, and saying, that this aid is given if human rights are upheld, for example. But it could also be saying there will be preferential access to the market, or there will be opportunities to share IP. Partnerships could be so much more than just looking at funding alone. And I think we need to be, again, it comes down to having a much broader approach to external policy, and thinking across the different tools that the EU has to offer, and then thinking about the normative kind of values that we want to put in those. And then, of course, it's up to countries to say, actually, no, we're not interested in that, and that's fine. But I think thinking more creatively is something that can be considered.
More creatively, yeah. Thank you so much. Ambassador, would you like to come in?
Yes, I guess I would like to refer to two things. One was this question, but I don't know if I understood it properly, is what happened with the new norms of European Union regarding CBAM, and we have been involved in that, not because Chile is has any problem, but we have been for solidarity, we have been working with Malaysia and Indonesia, because also it's a way of breaking trust and working and confidence, especially because you don't know, what I understand is not even clear how we are going to apply it here, and it's very confusing, and they are sort of pretending that they don't think what all this geolocalization is going to cause for a small producer. It's very complicated. So I think that's something that it should be talked more about it, especially as it was said before, this world is very complex and you need to work multilaterally, and you need to build trust and alliance, but in values. And regarding human rights, just to mention that for Chile, is one of our principles of policy, foreign policy. You know that we have a break of democracy in 1973, and we had a very bad time. And one of the things we did when we transitioned to democracy again in 1990 was to establish in the first agreement we had with the European Union, that it was a cooperation agreement, an essential element that we have to be the respect of human rights and the prevalence of democracy. So for us, I would say for almost all of Latin America, that's a very relevant. Human rights are a top priority.
Thank you very much. And there's Dora's point was that also, I think, on CBAM and on the external aspects of the Green Deal, there has to be more consultation prior with countries like yours and, of course, Southeast Asian countries and others as well. Karim, from you, please.
Thank you. 3 points on France, financing, and the complexity of policies. On France, you don't have to be friends with everybody, but you have to know where are your friends and your interests. And it is time to do a review of where are your friends. And when you have a friend, you take care of your friends, if you want them to remain your friends. There are countries who are defying the European Union. They are bringing war to the European Union. Others are competing on technology and using under the belt strategies, etc. So you know where are your friends, and you know where are your interests. I mean, foreign policy is driven by interest. I agree on humanitarian rights, etc. But it is. We don't. We work together. We don't have to be the same. Your colleagues here at these institutions, they share a common goal and a couple of ideas and a purpose, a sense of something, but they don't have to be alike. Thank God. I don't want to be, we want a world where everybody is the same. There is a say by the Sufis, Rumi, that says intelligent people want to change the world, wise people change themselves. So there is a little bit of that. It's a time, it's a context where we all need to change a little bit. And it is tougher for the incumbents than than compared to the outsider. It's tougher to be here and to have a sense of decline than to be an outsider coming from much further down and going up. There's a little bit of that. Second point on the complexity of policies. There is a context happening in a context, and we all feel overwhelmed. It's tough, it's difficult, and our governments all around the world are not organized to face such challenges. You know, the ministry, the structures, etc. You know, demographics. It's a change of paradigm. What's happening in Europe in terms of demography. Climate is another one. And of course, it's happening with crisis, increasing defense budget, the inheritance of the multiple crises since 2008, showing in public finance, etc., etc. But this is shared among all of us. This is not only due to European Union again, but it has stronger echo and consequences here because the initial condition, the initial situation was much better as compared to this emerging South. The third one is on financing. Financing is back as it was in the early 50s post-colonial world. Financing development, financing the new infrastructure, greening the world, etc. So financing development in a way and financing the transition on a new green development in Europe, in advanced economies, the same challenge. Europe has a big role to play in the reform of the international financial architecture, the Bretton Woods institutions. You have great institutions like the EIB, the BRD, etc. So we don't have time to talk about this, but this is where we have common challenges and we can do things together. Another one is energy. You know, I'm sorry to say, but green hydrogen is here. It's not Europe to Chile. I mean, proximity is fundamental, and we can have the electrons traveling rather than have the pipelines, which are very costly, etc. So I think there are lots of things we can do together very concretely, and you choose your friends. I mean, if you think some countries you don't want to do business with, you don't have to do business with. Why do you want to put on your shoulders, you know, sort of mission impossible mission of transforming the world and, you know, don't know the word in English, it's called the magistère politique, which use huge pressure on yourselves. So I think we can help a little bit. It's not that we're better, but it's just we're the outsiders, so we are sort of fresher, you know, and then we have the energy and we don't feel threatened by the new sort of context. We feel, on the contrary, we feel that there's more space. So, and you still have friends. Don't get too pessimistic and too anxious. I mean, life is beautiful and you have many things to do again.
You're reassuring us.
Yeah, and you have younger generations here. Again, look at the vote across generations in Europe. It's saying a lot.
Saying a lot, which is not always in the right direction. So you quoted Rumi, and I'm going to end also with a Rumi quote, right? So he says, "Gold turns to ashes in the hands of the wicked, and ashes turn to gold in the hands of the wise." So let's hope as we go forward, we have wisdom and the wise taking care of us.
It was not coordinated.
But we obviously have the same taste.
Amazing.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Let's give our panelists.
Very interesting, thank you. Enlightening, thank you so much.
Karim, merci beaucoup. Merci.